I want to begin by quoting the jury in the Manhattan hush money payment trial. Guilty, 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 guilty. This was what the jury pronounced unanimously on every count. My Republican colleagues don't really contest Donald Trump's guilt. This is the fascinating thing. Their argument is essentially he should never have been prosecuted, or they falsely claim it was a political prosecution, or they falsely claim it should have been a misdemeanor, not a felony. But they don't contest, not really, that Donald Trump was making hush money payments to a porn star to hide their affair from voters. What they're really saying is they're more than comfortable nominating and electing as the President of the United States someone making hush money payments to a porn star. The party formerly of the moral majority is now, I suppose, hoping to fashion some kind of immoral majority to reinstate Donald Trump as president. The presidency, the most powerful office in the world, and not the most powerful because of the size of our military, but because of the power of our ideas. And what is the animating idea of a Trump presidency? It is dictatorship. It is power at all costs. And this is also tragically the animating idea of the Republicans on this committee. Power at all costs. What else can explain what it would profit them to give up their political soul but a world of power? Ambassador Eisen, I want to ask historian Eisen a question. Is there any period of our history that sheds light on what we're going through today? Have we ever seen one party or the other so completely abandon oath to the Constitution, commitment to truth, commitment to decency, so willing to tear down the rule of law, our institutions, our justice system, anything that gets in the way of power? Have we ever seen anything like this?
Three periods come to mind, Mr. Schiff. The first is the founding period, and in particular, the ferment between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, when the founders and the framers, famously the Federalist Papers, a passage you know well, worried about that in that period of instability, a tyrant would arise. That was resolved by one of the fortunate accidents, not just in American history, but I dare say in the history of the world, George Washington's establishing the tradition of peaceful transition that Donald Trump ultimately broke for the first time in our history. Number two, the Civil War period, when we had those within who also proclaimed that they would not accept American rule of law. And that period of divisiveness is also found in the post-Civil War era, the decline of Reconstruction, that assault on our constitutional system that became the Jim Crow era. Those are three precedents. We see other dangers, including here in Congress, the period of McCarthyism. Donald Trump represents the most grave danger to this country, at least since the end of Jim Crow, very likely since the commencement of the Civil War, and perhaps since the founding of our nation from within.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan.
This is amazing construction of some kind of crime here, but when we dig down to the bottom of it and try to find out what the underlying crime is, I don't think that's been discussed enough, or what the supposed underlying crime is. One of the propositions was that hush money should be reported as a campaign finance expense. Okay, if somebody pays their attorney to seal divorce records because they may be going to run for office, or they are running for office, Mr. Trainer, is that a campaign finance expense? Is that something you see on campaign finance reports?
That is not. It is something that you would see. Legal fees are often reported, and it has been the tradition at the commission in looking at those legal fees that we don't question what the attorney-client privilege between the candidates and the lawyer are of what's needed in those particular circumstances.
So let me use another example. In 1999, Bill and Hillary Clinton bought a house in New York, obviously influenced the election of the Senate race there in New York because they moved into the house so that she could run for Senate. Is that a campaign finance expense? Is everything that could influence a campaign finance expense?
Well, under Mr. Bragg's interpretation, it would be, but under normal campaign finance law, it would not be. There are distinct similarities here between the John Edwards prosecution in 2008, where he paid over $1 million to his mistress to keep her quiet, and was prosecuted by the Department of Justice for that, and was ultimately acquitted on one count and had a mistrial on all 5 counts. Because the jury was given a correct charge as to what the federal law was. In this particular case, the jury was given an incorrect jury charge as to what the law is, and they come out with a completely opposite ruling.
I asked my campaign finance treasurer if I could pay my wife $10,000. She's got more dirt on me than anybody else, and then report that as a campaign finance expense. And he's very fastidious. He manages the finances of at least a dozen different campaigns. And he looked at me like I was crazy. Yet, isn't that sort of the same theory that Alvin Bragg had here? That something like that could be reported as a campaign finance expense?
It's very similar to what's happened here.
So, Congress has paid over $17 million in hush money for sexual misconduct inside of the offices in these buildings. And what's more is that was taxpayer money, right? The allegation is that President Trump paid $130,000 of his own money. But here in Congress, there may be some on this dais. I mean, I'm for turning loose all of these records. Who in here has had the taxpayer pay for their sexual misconduct charges the hush money? I bet there's some over there. There may be some over here. I don't know, but I do know it's taxpayer money. And I do know not a single penny of it has been turned in as a campaign finance expense. Is the FEC going to investigate the $17 million that Congress has paid to settle, behind closed doors, these sexual misconduct allegations?
Congressman, if a complaint were to come to us about it, I'm sure it would be thoroughly investigated.
I might file one because it seems like anybody could do this. But let me just ask this. Is this verdict going to be vacated? Attorney General Bailey, what do you think?
It absolutely should be.
On what grounds?
Numerous grounds. I think the 5 grounds I laid out in my opening statement provide sufficient justification to undermine the credibility of the conviction. I think there are additional grounds as well, but I think that the constitutional violations, the due process violation, the jury unanimity, 6th Amendment problem alone, the gag order is violative of the First Amendment. I mean, the prosecutorial misconduct, the conviction is replete with legal error.
Ms. Foley, do you think this is going to be vacated, this verdict?
I do, and I think eventually it's going to be reversed based on legal grounds rather than mixed questions of fact and law. So some of the evidentiary issues, some of the bias issues, I think they're more difficult to win on appeal because the appellate courts owe deference on these evidentiary determinations of trial judges. Bias is very difficult to win on appeal because the judge has so much latitude in deciding whether to recuse himself. That's why the due process errors are so critical here, because obviously due process errors are questions of law. They get de novo standard of appellate review. The appellate courts owe absolutely no deference whatsoever.
So the irony here is this is going to be vacated, and this trial was all about trying to influence an election using the process as the punishment. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record 3 documents. One is entitled FEC Drops Investigation into Trump Hush Payments. This is from 3 years ago. I'd like to introduce a document. Congress has paid $17 million in sexual misconduct and discrimination settlements. This was in Axios in 2017. And my third and final document I'd like to introduce is from CNN. Congress paid out $17 million in settlements. Here's why we know so little about that money. Thank you. I yield back.
Without objection. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Just a show of hands for anyone in the room who hung out with a felon today. Hey guys, probably want to get your hands up if you were hanging out with convicted felon Donald Trump. I don't think anyone on our side did. But that's why we're here. Ambassador Eisen, what city did Donald Trump commit his crimes in?
In New York City, Mr.
Where were the jurors drawn from for Donald Trump's trial?
From Manhattan.
Did defendant Trump have a say in picking his jury?
I was there for it. There was a vigorous voir dire. His defense counsel were extremely active and I thought effective.
And after that jury of his peers, his neighbors, deliberated, they had to make 34 decisions. 12 jurors, 34 decisions. What did they say?
They decided 34 times that Donald Trump falsified documents to cover up his 2016 criminal election interference scheme.
408 straight times they said the word guilty. Now let's transfer or fast forward to another trial that took place recently. The president's son, Hunter Biden, he tried to plead, was not able to do that. He was found guilty, and actually I heard your side in Fox News celebrating the verdict, celebrating the idea that a jury of his peers found him guilty. So again, when it hurts their guy, it's a rigged jury. When it hurts the president's son, we celebrate the jury. I want to talk a little bit about judicial bias because they've suggested that there's a bias that occurred in this case. Ambassador Eisen, in Donald Trump's other case, where he's alleged to have stolen national security secrets, who appointed the judge to the bench in the Southern Florida federal case?
Unlike the special counsel in the Hunter Biden prosecution, who is a Trump holdover, David Weiss, that was a last minute, referring back to our history, midnight appointment, you can call it, by Donald Trump of Judge Eileen Cannon.
Are you kidding me? Donald Trump is complaining about bias in his case, and he's on trial for stealing national security documents with a judge that he appointed? Well, that's interesting. I didn't hear any of you all talking about that. Well, let's talk about the Supreme Court, who's deciding whether he has absolute immunity and can send the Navy SEALs to kill any of his opponents, as he alleges in his arguments that he can do. One judge is flying an insurrection flag in solidarity with the insurrection on January 6th that tried to overturn Donald Trump's loss in the 2020 election. Another judge's wife was at the president's speech on January 6th, right before the insurrection occurred. But Ambassador Eisen, I want to talk about, now that he's a convicted felon, declared 408 times guilty by his neighbors, are convicted felons allowed to hold a security clearance?
No.
Are convicted felons allowed to serve in the military?
No.
Are convicted felons allowed to visit most countries?
There's a long list of countries they cannot visit.
And typically, the terms of probation for a convicted felon, do they allow you to hang out with other felons?
That's prohibited. There are other prohibitions, such as gun ownership.
That's probably going to be a problem if your friends are criminals like Paul Manafort, who was Donald Trump's former campaign manager, vice chairman of the campaign, Rick Gates, aide to the campaign and convicted felon Roger Stone, former White House aide, also convicted, Peter Navarro. Steve Bannon, also a convict, on his way to jail soon. Former National Security Advisor, also a convict, Michael Flynn. And his accountant, Alan Weisselberg, currently in custody right now. But this is the person who you all chose to hang out with this morning, delaying the original start time of our hearing because rather than getting work done for people who need us to work, you chose a felon over helping families. We're going to flip that, and we're going to choose families over felons, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. Ask unanimous consent to submit for the record an article in Open Secrets that says that Ambassador Eisen bundled between